Hi everybody, it's Julessa. First of all, I want to say thank you to everybody who's subscribing to my channel. I really appreciate it, and leaving comments and subscribing and sharing with your friends is really helping my channel to grow. So thank you. Anyway, in this week's video, we're going to be making hinges. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we get started making hinges, I just wanted to say that there are a lot of different ways to make hinges and very specific ways to make hinges that bend in a certain amount of degrees. Today, I'm just going to show you a basic three-knuckle hinge, and I'm going to do it the way I find to be the easiest. It certainly isn't the only way to do it, but it's one of the ways that I like to do it. And I wanted to show you an example of a hinge, a three-knuckle hinge that can be done in a different way. One way is to cut your three knuckles first before you actually solder them, and then place your metal. This obviously doesn't match because these are our samples for today, but you place your metal on each section of your hinge and then solder them together, cut off the excess. That's not the way we're going to be doing it today, but I wanted to show that to you before we get started. The second way is to create a hinge where you've got a full hinge on each side. So let's say like that, and a third one on this side. And you cut out the slots for each one of them, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. But I also wanted to show you how you choose your hinges. One of the main things you need to do is to make sure, oops, I put the wrong one away, is to make sure that your pins fit. This is the hinge I'm choosing because of the thickness of my metal. And this is the pin that's going to go into my hinges and hold it in place. And if you notice, it slides in fairly easily, but there's no bend and there's very little room for that rivet to move around. And I'm actually going to be using a tube rivet today, not an actual wire rivet. You can do it either way. You can use a tube rivet or you can use a wire rivet. But today I'm going to do a tube rivet. So let's go back to choosing your tubing for your hinges. This metal here is approximately 2 millimeters thick. It's actually 2.4 millimeters thick. And what I want to do is find a tube that is roughly the same thickness on the outer diameter, or the width on the outer diameter, plus a little bit more. So in this particular case, the tubing that I chose is 3.1 millimeters. So it's going to stick out a little bit over the edges of both of my both sides of my metal. And I want that because I want it to bend fairly wide. I don't necessarily want it just to bend 45 degrees. And I'll show you an example. This is the same type of hinge. It's a little bit smaller hinge, so it's only going to bend in that direction. And so when we do our hinges today, we're probably going to get roughly about the same movement, but we'll check it and validate it against this sample that I've already made. So I have already pre-cut my pieces of metal, and here is my third piece here. These are about 12 millimeters in width, or I should say length, and about 15 millimeters in width. Doesn't matter what your sizes are for your practice, just make sure that it's something that you can manage. And like I said, I've chosen a tube rivet that's going to be just a smidge larger than the width or the thickness of my metal. One of the most important things to remember when you're doing hinges is you don't want your hinge to sit on a flat edge. And the reason for that is because you're not getting enough surface area for the solder to hold onto, and you're more likely to see that hinge tear right off the edge of the metal. So what you need to do is cut a chamfer that your tubing will fit in. And by that, I mean a rounded channel. And there's a couple of ways to do it, and I'm going to show you an example of how I do it. But just so you know, these are already pre-done. The chamfers are already pre-made in these two pieces. So I'm going to show you on the last piece that needs to be done. So I'm going to go ahead and switch out to my other pin. I use a Benchmate system to hold my metal. And it doesn't matter which side I do it on because I've already created the middle piece, which has the chamfer on both sides. So this is going to be an end piece, so I can do it on either side of this. So I'm just going to place it in here on one side. And what I'm going to do, I need a cylinder burr and a ball burr. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a cylinder burr and create a channel all along this side to get my U shape started that's going to actually hold my tubing. I'm going to get that started there, and then when that's started all the way across, I'm going to take the ball burr and run the ball burr completely through. And why I'm doing that is because I want the chamfer U to be wide enough to hold the entire tube and be able to have a lot of surface area for the soldering to happen. My cylinder burr is 1.5 millimeters and my ball burr is 2.4, which is almost the exact same diameter, diameter of my tubing that I'm going to be using for the actual hinge itself. So let's go ahead, get our cylinder burr ready. I'm getting my optivisor on so I can see closer. It's a little bit more light, and we're going to go ahead and start here. So I'm actually going to lock this down so it doesn't move. If you don't have a Benchmate system, you can always use a trusty wooden ring holder. This works just as well. You have to hold on to it, obviously, to get your chamfer in there, but that's okay. Either way, use a Benchmate system if you have it. If not, use your ring clamp. So I'm going to put a little Bur Lube on this. I'm going to bring this up just a smidge higher. And you notice I'm bracing my fingers because I don't want this to slip around the edge and it's going to rotate in this direction. So I'm going to brace my finger against the work and brace my thumb against the flex shaft. And we're going to go fairly slow. And I'm going to move it slowly along the edge until it makes a divot into the metal. And you're going to work at this slowly. Don't try to rush it. If you don't have a cylinder burr, you can also do this with just a straight ball burr. Just start with a smaller ball burr than the one that's the width of your diameter, or that's smaller than the diameter of your tubing, and then work your way up to the same width as the diameter of your tubing. Ooh. Very easy to move this around. Okay, so I'm going to turn this around and get the other side. Ooh. It's very easy to move that burr right across the top. Okay, so I've got my basic chamfer here, and I'll make sure that there's a photograph of that so you can see it. But this is the start of the chamfer. Now I'm going to switch to my ball burr. That is 2.4, which is basically the same diameter as my tubing for the hinge. And I'm going to run it down the chamfer that I started with the cylinder burr. And I want to make it wide enough so that there's a small little lip on both sides of the metal. And I'm going to test that with my tubing just to make sure I've gotten it deep enough. Put a little Bur Lube. No, actually I need to turn this so I can, there we go. I'm going to turn this around, get the other edge, because I want to make sure that the channel is the same depth all the way around. Okay, I'm going to take my tubing and test it. What I'm looking for on the tubing is that there isn't a top to bottom wobble and that it's sitting in there flush. And that way I know I'm getting a good solder joint, and I can tell right away this one is not flush. So I need to keep working on this area here. And you keep working it and testing it until you get it right. It's almost there. I'm gonna flip it around, make sure it's even on this side. Okay, let's check it one more time. And it sits flush now. So keep working at that until you get it right. Don't rush it. Make sure you get it flat and straight. That way when you go to put your hinges on with solder, you're ready to go and you don't have to worry about them not being even or coming off of your solder joint. So now that we've got that situated, I wanted to show you the hinge that I did before. So this hinge you can see is a tube hinge. I soldered the 4 tubes on, one on here, 2 on here, and 1 here. And then what I did is I cut out the center pieces so that I could have the center pieces on 2 of them anyway. So on this one, on this one and this one, so these 2, I cut out the center piece so I could fit the one that was the center here into my hinge on the left side. Same thing on the right side. So you can see here, I used a tube rivet to actually hold the pins in place. So now we're going to go over to the soldering board and solder our tubes on. Actually, before we do that, we need to cut the pins. Can't forget that step. So we know that the width of my metal is roughly 19 millimeters. So we want our tube to be about 19 millimeters as well. So I'm going to set this for 19. Let's say 20. Let's go an even 20. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I have just enough here. So I'm going to go ahead and mark the first one and cut it. Actually, before I cut it, I'm going to show you a tool, a tool that works a lot easier. This is a tube cutting jig, and what I'm going to do is set my tube in here and match the length, which looks to be about right as it is, match the length, and then use this as a guide to cut the tube with my saw. Has a little arm for you to hold in place. And I've actually taken the handle off it. It has a handle, and I found that it was unwieldy, so I took it off so that I can use it easier at my bench pin. And I'm going to cut 4 tubes the length of 20. So these now, let me get my other 2 pieces so I can show you. This is the centerpiece. I'm going to have 2 tubes, one on the left and right, soldered here. And then these 2 are the outside pieces. I'm going to have a tube soldered on each of these pieces, this one here and this one here. This is the one that fell on the floor, so I'll pull that one up obviously and solder it. But basically, once it's soldered, it's going to look like this. And then I'm going to cut out the excess tubing in order to make the hinge work with the pin right through it. So let's move this to the soldering board and get everything soldered together. Okay, I'm going to set this soldering up. I'm going to show you how I did the first one, talk you through that first one, and then we'll do each of the others after that. So the first thing you want to do, obviously, is get your flux ready. You want to flux your piece before you put your solder down. So I'm going to work on this one first. I'm going to use hard solder, and I'm going to be fairly generous with it. My pieces are kind of small, so I'm going to place 3 so I can make sure I get a good fillet, is what they call it, for the solder joint. I'm using a propane oxygen Smith little torch. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to concentrate my heat on the thicker element of the hinge, which is the plate piece. I don't want to focus my heat on the hinge because it's very, very tiny and it'll melt long before this is hot enough to actually get the solder to flow. So I'm going to heat it very gently to get the flux to bubble and stick. That'll help keep my solder in place and my hinge pin in place. Okay, so now I'm going to focus my heat on the larger piece of brass here. That's going to transfer heat to my hinge and have the solder flow between the 2 pieces. Now I'm going to put a little bit of heat on the hinge itself, and you can see my solder flowed pretty quickly and went straight through. Now I'm going to flip this over and check the other side and make sure the solder flowed through the other side of the joint. If not, I'm going to reheat it and pull the solder through the joint. And that's good right there. So let's get the other 2 joints ready, and I will go through each of those too. Make sure that you don't move your piece like I just did before your flux has finally, or I'm sorry, before your solder has settled with your hinge pin. Otherwise it'll move and then it'll cool into a spot where you didn't want your hinge to be. And you saw here how I had to replace and fix that. I had to reheat it and slide it down just a little bit. So be careful not to do that with brass. You won't generally see that with silver, but you will occasionally see it with copper and with brass. Okay, I have my pieces out of the pickle. I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to clean up the fire scale and the excess solder, and then I'm going to trim down the excess tubing so that it matches up with each one of the sheet pieces. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so I'm gonna test my pins. I've actually cut 4 pins that are gonna fit in each one of these hinges. So I'm gonna test the fit, make sure that they still fit. I have one to remount here still. Okay, I'm gonna slip the pins in and see how they fit. Nice and snug. And I've got a little excess on each side that I can flare out, so that's good. Ooh. See if I can get that pin out. It fits pretty snug, so that's good. It's not so tight that it won't move, but it's tight enough to where when I actually use my flaring tool, it won't slip out. So I'm going to go ahead and clean these up with a finer sanding disc. It's probably a medium. Let's put these back. And I'm going to go ahead and clean these up and speed it up for you. Okay, so I've got these cleaned up. Now what I'm going to do is take my dividers and measure the width of the tube. Then I'm going to take that on my ruler and see how much it is. So it's exactly 20 millimeters. So what that means is I'm going to divide 20 millimeters by 3, which will give me 6. It'll give me 18 plus 2 extra millimeters one way or the other. So I'm going to go, I'm sorry, yeah, 6. So I'm going to change this to 6 millimeters because I want 3 knuckles. So I want to mark from the end 6 millimeters in. Okay, so now I'm set at 6 millimeters. So what I'm going to do on my knuckles here, that's not 6 millimeters, it's 16 millimeters. I want 6 millimeters. So you got to be very careful about your measuring. Okay, that's 6 millimeters. So now I'm going to mark 6 millimeters on each side to determine where I'm going to be cutting. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is get my jeweler saw out and change my blade, excuse me, from a 1/0 to a 3/0 so that I can get a finer cut. So the next thing we want to do is clean up the areas that we actually remove the tubing on, because you can see here I've got a little bit of a chamfer and I need to clean that off. So I'm going to use my 4-square or my square file and file. Through. So I'm going to take one of these pins and try to insert it through all 3 pieces, and you'll know right away if it works, because if you can put the pin through 2 of the 3, then you know you got to work on that 3rd one. Okay, so let's try this. So the middle pin is not working so great. So let's double check and make sure my tube hasn't collapsed, which could be the case. And it seems like that was part of the problem. Okay, so let's try this again. Nope, I need to file these edges down a little bit more because they're a little bit too high. Okay, so now I've got the pin in, and I need to take and flare the edges. And the best way to do that is to take a tool and flare the edge just a little bit, flip it over on the other side, and flare that edge. And then what I like to do is use my chasing hammer and flatten that. Just like you would on a regular rivet. If that doesn't work, you can take a punch similar to one of these like you get at one of the box stores and stick the punch in to flare. This is a little bit more difficult to do because you got to hold it with several fingers and hands. That will flare it just enough to hold it in place. And then I will usually go over it again. So now I've got part of a working hinge. Now I need to match this one up with another piece. that looks exactly the same as this one and as, oops, this one. So this is our new one, and these are the two that I did as samples from before. In today's video, we made a three-knuckle hinge. It was a standard three-knuckle hinge. It's one of the many ways you can make hinges. Hopefully this was helpful for you. If so, give me a like. And if you have questions or comments or suggestions, please leave me a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. And subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this. Thank you, everybody. Bye.